Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on the top of page 1345. Concluded yesterday's paragraph that we learned on 1344, 1345 to sum up is essentially the joining of tzaddikim and Baalei Tshuva, that together in Mashiach's times in the future, there will be a fusion, a total yichud of that which is above and that which is below, basically spirit and matter. On the language that he spoke about, the yichud of Ma'aban. So both the tzaddik will have a yichud of Ma'aban, like we learned, the Ma of the neshama, of the divine light, but also dealing with Ban, as the tzaddik recognizes the need for tshuva as he climbs and sees, as he gets closer to the light and the deeper light, he becomes aware of how much more there is to do and the inadequacies. So there's an element of tshuva of Ban there, Ban within Ma, as explained on the previous paragraph on page 1344. And the Baal Tshuva as well has also both. Though his main focus is Ban, coming from the Yesh, from the darkness, but he also has Ma, as we learned, which is coming from the neshama, the tshuva that comes from the soul, which is Ma, as well, especially after tshuva, when he embraces Torah mitzvahs, which is also Shem Ma. And also Yesh Leimer, he said, can also say the element of grounding to make sure that the tshuva is not one, like with Rabbi Lezer ben Durdaya, that causes him to completely be consumed and dissolved and lose his identity in this world, but rather even a higher level of tshuva that keeps him grounded, that he can continue to live and bring that passion into the Torah mitzvahs that he does. So all this is a yichud of Ma'aban. The only difference is which is the ikar. Like he says, tzaddikim, the ikar is amshacha lamata, is drawing it down, and by the Baal Tshuva is to elevate it upward. So by a tzaddik, the primary force is oyer, that's at work, light, which is drawing down. By a Baal Tshuva, the primary
I don't hear anything. Do you hear anything, guys? Anybody hear anything? It's like froze. What's going on? I don't hear anything. Is there other people here?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Now I can. This second.
What was the last thing I said? The internet seems to have gone down here.
I don't know, but you were gone for a good minute and a half, and everything went off.
Well, do you remember? Anybody remembers the last thing that you heard me say? Did you hear me speak about the two people, the one very high up and the one below?
No,
Anybody?
but the last thing we heard was the shame ban within the tzaddik.
Really?
Yeah, it was like 2 minutes of nothing.
Okay, so I'll continue from where I left off. So the same ban of the tzaddik is within the ma, and the same thing is with the Baal Tshuva. He also has both. By him, primarily it's ban because it's coming from the darkness from below. But he also has ma, like he said. He has a divine soul. The tshuva is ban neshama lekis, which is primarily from Shema. After the tshuva, he embraces Torah mitzvahs. V'Yaakov halachadake, also Shema. And additionally, Shema also a grounding element that he does not expire. He does not get consumed and dissolved in this great passion, the Baal Tshuva, like Rabbi Eliezer ben Adai, who passed away, who died. But here's even a higher level of tshuva, that he remains intact and is able to infuse that passion of his tshuva into the Torah mitzvahs that he embraced. A higher level of bittul. So we have here the yichud of Ma'oban by him as well. And then we have the yichud of both, the tzaddik and the Baal Tshuva, because the tzaddik has tshuva, and the Baal Tshuva has also an element of ma. And that L'Asid Lave will all become one total fusion of the best, of the highest of ma, and the lowest of ban. Like he gave the example of the two people. One standing very high up in a mountain, one standing very low down. There are three ways for them to meet. Either the one above goes all the way down, the one below the one below goes all the way up, or they meet halfway. L'Asid Lave won't be halfway. You'll have the highest levels of oyer will come all the way down into ban, all the way into the yesh, and the lowest level of the yesh will become one with the highest levels of the divine. As we learned, he doesn't say Helam Ha'atzmi, but it'll be Shorshe Mekere Ha'atzmi, and you'll have the total joining Hashem Echad, Havaya Echad, B'Yichud Ma'oban Lamata, and Shema Echad, B'Yichud Ma'oban Lamayla. She'll have it both above and below. And that will be the Havaya Echad is either below and Shema Echad is above, or like he says, Yeshlem is the other way around. Havaya Echad, that the Mata will be the low, below will be like above, and Shema Echad, that the darkness itself will become light on its own. So you have the Yichud Ma'oban Lamata, and it'll all be one Mahava Echad Be'echad. Okay. With that, he's now going to go back. And as I mentioned yesterday, this is all based on the language of the Maimer of the Mittler Rebbe, based on the Alter Rebbe's Maimer from Tov Kuf Samach Gimel. Yesh lahav hine yesh lahav in the Malka Mashiach Asel Lasava. Okay. Now he's going to take us back to what we learned earlier on page 1306, and even earlier, page 1208, the beginning of volume 3. The actual transformation. Remember that there's different ways to transform darkness. And we're focusing primarily the second way is a transformation, but it comes from Oyer that replaces the darkness, like by tzaddikim. And the third way is that the darkness itself, the distress, reaches all the way into the Helam Ha'atzmi, which is the third type of sweetening from the Baal Tshuva. And now we talked about joining the two together. So now he's going to go back, and we're going to also see how it connects to the verse, V'yadaita ayim, v'ashavesa levavecha ke'avayu lekim b'shamayim mimal, v'al ha'aretz mitachas. You may recall, shamayim mimal is above, and ha'aretz mitachas is below. So you see here also the connection of Havaya Chad or Shema Chad, because he wants it both above and below, the total union. And ultimately, Ein Oid, which is the third level, where the darkness itself gets transformed and reaches its core, its essence in the Helam Ha'atzmi. So now he's going to go back to explain and bring it back to the original themes that go back, as I said, all the way back from 1208, which is the beginning of this volume, literally, bottom of 1208. That's where it began. Actually 1207, but 1208, yeah. And also 1306, if you want to follow the pages. So here's what he says now. Umakol Hanal Yuvan, this is the next paragraph on page 1345. If you want to follow along, it's ayinbeis.com. Umakol hanal yuvim, from all the above will be understood, Masha kosev alayla ki yom yoyim, that the night will radiate like day. The hainu, which means shalayla ba'atzma, that the night itself will radiate. V'loy mitzad eir hashemesh klal, not due to the fact that the sun will be so bright and so powerful that it will also illuminate the night. He made it clear that that's not that ultimately Lavikim is that the darkness of night will radiate on its own. So you could say one thing, the sun is so powerful that it shines also into the night. No, the night itself will radiate because within it will be revealed the avir hanelam. The avir is that environment, that air that we talked about on page. This goes back all the way to page 1329. There's avir and air, and avir, he said, is like the rishimu, which ultimately rooted in the helam ha'atzmi, in the core concealment, which is a state of darkness. So that's what will happen. The night will reveal its very source. Like it says, that in the future, the sun will no longer be the source of the day of daylight. God, Havaya, will be light forever, or light of the world. What is Ir Havaya? The Ir Havaya Elam b'yem ubelayla. That Ir Havaya will be both forever, or both day and night. In other words, it's a different level of light. It's not that the day will extend into the night, and not that the sun will illuminate the darkness. Like he writes in Mitzudas David, and I recall, I'm going back to 1306, I think he actually says it. Let's see here. Okay. Yeah, he doesn't bring the Mitzudas David, but he brings this idea. On 1208, let me see something. Let's see if he mentions there. Okay. Okay, good. The Eir HaShemesh, because when the light of the sun, when you say that the sun was so powerful that it would also illuminate the darkness, then it only dispels. It only dissipates. It essentially dispels the darkness. When you say Laila Kayem Yer, you're saying the night itself became light. If it was the sun that was doing it, then you say it's dispelling the darkness. You're pushing it aside. Not that the darkness itself becomes light. And that's why, very simple proof, if the sun was so powerful and was able to continue shining in the night, when it would stop shining, when it would cease shining, the darkness will come back as it was before, because it didn't transform the darkness, it just overpowered it. That's the power of light, like the second level of the light transforming the darkness from without. But when it says, so the Apostle says, that the sun will no longer be the source of the Le'er, but it'll be Havaya, because when Havaya is the source, this will be an eternal transformation. because the darkness will be transformed to light, not just dissipated by the light. And the air will be in a form of eternal, and it won't be darkness at all. So it's interesting, he says the light will be eternal because, like he said before, it's a combination of both the quality of light, but also the darkness itself has been transformed. Okay. So this is the description of what will be in the future, the full transformation. Any questions? Because now he's going to explain this a bit more, this idea. The inyan of this is, like it says elsewhere, the inyan ad shumeida al agbola kumay ad potove. Okay. So in Hebrew, there's a word called ad, until. When you say ad potove, till here you shall come. So it's like creating a boundary and saying, come till here and not further. So whenever we say ad, we're giving a limit. Like there's expression in halacha, ad v'lo ad b'chlal, or ad v'ad b'chlal. So for example, you say Shabbos begins Friday night and goes ad seisar kerchoven, until the stars come out Saturday night. So ad is a limit. Like he says, the word ad means shumeda, it indicates al hagbola, on a limitation, on a boundary, on a parameter, ukamoy ad po tove, that you'll come till here and not further. Another meaning in ad, however, is the opposite. The gam lo shenitzchi. We also find ad is used to express something that's eternal. Ukamoy la ade ad yimlech, that he will reign as a king, la ade ad, forever and ever. Or like we say, binyan ade ad, an eternal edifice. So suddenly we're using ad, not ad as till here, but ad as like forever. So he's now going to cite what it says elsewhere in explaining this. Tehine b'dovish alamayla mazman legamri, and the thing that's completely beyond time, eina shayich lema by inyan anitzchis. You can't call it eternal. Because it's altogether not in the category or domain of time altogether. As soon as you say something is eternal, you're saying it could have been not eternal. It's in the world of time that has things that are temporary or impermanent, and you're saying no, it's eternal. So the mere fact that you say something is eternal, you're saying it's in the world of time, because eternity is essentially eternal time. But something in the begeder azman klal, you don't say that. You don't say the word nitzchis. Rak be'inyan azman, only in the world of time, or in the domain of time, yitak and lemer inyan nitzchis. There, it's applicable to say that something is eternal or something's not eternal. Something can last short-lived, or it can be longer-lived, or forever. It's like the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, that when it comes to seichel, you don't even say seichel can't be touched tangibly. It says anyone will say that ef shalamasha shabiyadayim, that you can't touch intelligence, he'll be laughed at. You don't even negate that. It's completely not in the domain of tangibility that you can touch it. When you say something, I can't touch it, you could say it would be reachable in some way, but right now it's in a state, or it's a state that I can't touch it because it's beyond me. But something that's completely not in that domain, you don't even negate and say I can't touch it, because it's not in the world of touch. So I was giving an example. So nitzchias means it's in the world of time, but it's eternal. Like when you say, let's say binyan adayad, you're saying a marriage could be something, God forbid, that's not eternal, that's temporary. You say, no, it should be an eternal edifice. Or yimlech adayad, you could be a king, and the king is a temporary king. His kingdom lasts, his reign lasts for a certain period of time. You say yimlech adayad, no, that his forever will be king, an eternal king. Like you say David HaMelech, that Malchus belongs to the domain of David, that his children will always be the kings forever and ever. Now, because time is in a state of definition or limitation or parameter. Since man is in the world of limit, so that's why v'yitaken, it's applicable to say there, bligvul, that it doesn't have a limit. That the time will not seize it forever, will not pause at all forever. Like it says in the pasuk, v'shnesecha lo yitamu, and your years will not end, will not come to an end. The yomim v'shanim hem b'chinas gvul, because when you say yomim v'shanim, days and years, they clearly are agbola hem b'chinas agbola hazman. They're both there. When you say a day, a year, they have a limit in time. So therefore, you can say that even though it has a limit, but your years, I'm giving you a blessing, or I'm assuring you that they will not end. That they will not come to any ending or any conclusion. And they will not stop or pause forever. Now, what is this in Spheris? What level is this? This level of Ad? So he says, "V'hainu b'bchinas Malchus." This is in the level of Malchus. The Shamu Inyan Azman, Melech Molech Yimlech, Avar Heva v'Asid. Malchus. There you say the word Melech Molech Yimlech, which means past. Melech, he was a king. He's now king and will be the king. So it's talking about past, present, and future. I think chapter 7 or 6. I think chapter 7. He says that's Malchus. So you see here that the word Ad that he described till now, on one hand it's a limit, Ad. On the other hand, it could also mean eternal, but it's not a contradiction because the world of eternity is also only in the world where there's something that has a limit. That's where you could say something is not limited, it's eternal. I'm speculating that that's how he's bringing it together. But we have to still see where this is going, because all this is meant to explain the transformation of darkness, which I'm not yet clear how that's going to be leading into this. So now he continues. So Malchus on its own is time, past, present, future. But now, when Ein Sof, the infinite divine light, radiates in Malchus, that will transform, and Malchus will become an eternity. So without Ein Sof, Malchus is the source for time and the limits of time. And the Ein Sof causes it to become nitzchias, which means when someone says you'll have for life, eternal life, that the days and years that on their own, they're in the domain and they fall under the world of time, the over v'heva, so the over v'heva of past and present. So we say lo yifsek lo elam, that this world of Malchus, where on its own, the days and years on its own, it's limited, we're saying lo yifsek lo elam, that will never come to an end. So in the world of time, you'll have eternal time. Like when you say someone should have arichas yomim v'shanim tevis, that they should live long. Now here, obviously, he's talking more than just long, he's talking forever. Chaim nitzchim. But what does this do? This is due to the infinite divine light that's higher than time. Due to that power, it infuses time, that time should go on, tamid, permanently, and should not cease or not pause, should not come to an end. Because on time itself, due to its very inherent limitation, acheshu mugbal ba'atzmei, being that on its own, it's a defined creation that has a limit, so there has to be hagbala. There should be a stop. There should be a stop of how long it extends. That should extend and continue and extend for a certain amount of time, so and so much time, and then it should pause, cease, and stop, and it's battle, and no longer. It's like when you designate something as an expiration date. So it lasts that length. That's what Zman is on its own. But when you bring into it Erein Sof Baruch Hu, you bring in the divine infinite light, Nimshach Hazman la'elam, ve'ena nifsikum is battle. The time will continue on and will not cease and pause and stop and come to an end. And this is like he says in the work of the Rameh, Mipanoi has a sefer called Pelech Harimin. It's a commentary on the Pardes of the Ramak. So what does he say there? Be'inyan Shem Ein Sof, where he explains the name when you say something's called Ein Sof, no end. The Ein Rotzein Alem Mehusev Atzmuse. That by Ein Sof you're not referring to Atzmus, to the core and essence of the divine, because Ein Sof is not, you don't say something is Ein Sof. Atzmus is beyond even Ein Sof. Ein Sof is saying in a world where there is an end, this thing has no end. But by Atzmus you can't say it's not in that domain altogether. So he says, El al Shmei Yisbarach. Ein Sof is referring on God's name, not on God himself. The Baal Hashem, Pshitashu Ein Sof. The one who owns that name, the one whose that name is associated with, meaning Atzmus Samuhu, is the Eibishter, who is the owner. Baal Hashem basically means the person who this is, his name is this name. He for sure is Ein Sof. Being that he also has no beginning. He has no beginning and therefore he has no end. And everything that has no beginning, Kadman, is obviously eternal. But that is not because it's in the world. That's because it's fundamentally beyond any type of limits altogether. Avaloi kol nitzchi kadman, says the Pelech Harimin. But not everything that's eternal is also ein leitchila. Is kadman, meaning has no beginning. There are many things, like he says, sherabi minan nimtzoyim. There are many of the creations or many of the things that came into being that God created. Yir nitzchim b'ratzna beira. They are because the desire of the creators that they should be eternal, so they're eternal. The ein shum echad mehem kadman, and none of them, God forbid, can you say doesn't have a beginning. They all have a source. It's God, but there are things God chose to create that are temporary, that are limited, that have a finite nature, and there are things that are nitzchi that go on forever. So you see from this that the idea of Ein Sof applies to an entity that has a beginning, but God chooses it should have no end. Which means even though fundamentally these creations are nifsadim, they are temporary, which means they're what's the word? Fungible, not fungible. What's the word when you say something is impermanent? They are nifsadim. They ultimately deteriorate. They're subject to aging and therefore deterioration.
Ephemeral.
Being that they have a beginning, so that means that they are not fundamentally eternal. They are fundamentally something that are impermanent. Just as they have a beginning, they should have an end. Nevertheless, they become eternal because the desire of the Creator is infusing in them internally. It's with the power of Ein Sof that they become eternal. Take, for example, we talk about Chazokim Kiyem Hibaram. Talk about the sun and the moon, the celestial bodies. So the Gemara says in Yerushalmi that they are permanently strong, exactly as they were in the creation. Unlike what the science says, that the sun is getting weaker, according to Torah, they are as strong as they were, and they have a permanent element in them. Why? Not because they fundamentally they're creations. So why it makes total sense the sun would burn out, but because God wants them to have a permanence to them. Until he says, I don't want them to have permanence, which is after 6,000 years, etc. So bottom line is, the fact that they are permanent is, on one hand, they are by their fundamental nature is not to be permanent, but God infuses them with something, superimposes into them something of permanence, and that's what the Pelech HaRimen is saying. So we see from all of this that Ad Nitzchi is in the world of time where there is an element of limit, and yet the Ein Sof within the Malchus gives it a permanence. U'kamoshen is bar le'il, as was explained earlier, Dibra Maskal Leman Das. We're talking now in volume 2, page 684. U'bekame Duchtin, and a number of discourses. This point was discussed quite a few times. I remember at least three times for sure, earlier in Ayin Beis. Now he goes back to Malchus. U'kamoy came b'bchinas hazman de Malchus. So too, when you're going back to the time, which is in the level of Malchus, that they gili Ein Sof, through the revelation of the infinite divine light, Yiyazman b'chinas nitzchitz, time itself will become eternal, Shelo yufsek le'elam, will never cease. The Zehu Inyan Yichud Kutchebricha v'Shchinta. And this is the meaning when we say the Yichud, the union of Kutchebricha and the Shechina. Remember, because Shechina is Malchus, Kutchebricha refers to Zah, which is more connected to Ein Sof. So we say, Leman Yichud Kutchebricha v'Shchinta, that the union, you're bringing together the Ein Sof into the world of time, into the world of Malchus. The Hainu Yichud Havaya v'Elikim. This is the Yichud of Havaya and Elikim. The Havaya u'lamayla mazman. Havaya is higher than time. We say Hoya Hoiva v'yiyah ke'echad. Past, present, future, all are one. Higher than time. The Elikim u'bchinas azman. And Elikim is the divine as it manifests in time. Vayichud Havaya v'Elikim, and the union of Havaya Elikim, who shemei b'chinas lamayla mazman, is that the Havaya, the higher than time, should radiate ad shazman ugam kenitzchi, to the point that it also transforms Elikim, that it should also become eternal, she'ena nifsek le'elam, and should never cease. So still, you can ask the question, so 1 second here, what's the connection to what we learned? So remember, we learned that the future, the sun will no longer be the Le'er Yamim, it will be Havaya Le'er Elam. So all this is coming to explain that Havaya, which is higher than time, is going to be and radiate and transform the darkness itself, Olam Nitzchi, forever. And why is that forever? Because it's transforming it from within. If it was the sun, so it would be like imposing it. So as long as the light is shining, fine, the light is shining. So therefore, the darkness has been dissipated. But when it comes from Havaya, it actually transforms it. He hasn't focused on the word transformation. He's talked more about the eternal element of it. But this is going to lead, I see in the next paragraph, this is going to lead us back to the pasuk v'yadaita yem v'shavei salach ke'avayu alakim, which will then lead us to the end of the pasuk ein oid. So Rebbe Rashab is tying this all together shortly, but meanwhile he's building the case for what Havaya does, that it creates an eternal element and it's not temporary. That's what he focused on now. That's Havaya le'er elam. Havaya le'elam. Any questions? Okay. So this has explained how Havaya has now transformed Elikim, Zman, to be eternal. But it's not the highest level. Because remember, the highest level is that Elikim itself is transformed. Not through Havaya. As he said at the beginning of this volume. that we want even a higher level, coming from the darkness itself, from the finite itself. Koyach HaGvul should reveal the Koyach HaGvul above the Helam HaAtzmi, which is deeper even than Havaya that he's talking about right now. So that's what the next paragraph is going to deal with. Omnom, next paragraph. Amiti sinyan yichud Havaya v'lekim. The true union of Havaya lekim, who shalakim yeh k'moy Havaya mamish. Not just that lekim should get the level of Havaya, in this case nitzchi, or the oir should transform the darkness in a permanent way, but the lekim itself should be mamish like Havaya. V'hainu shazman atzmei yeh l'mayla mazman. So now he's talking in time itself, not just that time on its own is finite, and you've made it into infinite because there's a power called Havaya, Ein Sof, that's causing it to be infinite. But that time, that the finite itself is going to reveal the infinite power of God. That's what he's going to talk about now. So there's going to be quite an interesting twist here. This is how ultimately the transformation of this world is not just that we bring the infinite divine and the transcendent divine into a finite existence. That's Havaya Elikim. But even the very finite element of existence, just like we spoke before about darkness, the very finite element of existence, Elikim itself will be one with the power of God's infinite power to create the finite. So it's not the oir or the infinite infusing the finite, is the finite itself discovering its very source. That's what he's going to explain now. So this is going to require some a little use of imagination. What this means exactly? It's hard enough to imagine something that is finite and eternal. To say, for example, that time and the finite should go on forever is one thing. Here we're going even further, saying that the finite itself expresses something that's infinite. So he says, "Ve'ein zeh kanal." This is not like we just mentioned before, "Shazman yeh nitzchi," that time will be now forever. Shari ein zeh ela b'chinas zman. Shari ein zeh ela b'chinas zman, because at the end of the day, that level we spoke about is still a level of time. Shari hu be'etzem, shu be'etzem bal gvul. Time by definition is a bal gvul. Time means something that's finite. Seconds, minutes, hours, days. And time also has a certain limit. Dahainu kol yom, which means every day, v'kol shana, and every year, hakol b'bchinas gvul. Time is defined by gvul. It's finite parameters. So what changed? Nifsek mitzad ha'oros Ein Sof. Ein Sof has now entered into that domain of the gvul of zman, of the finite parameters of time, and has caused it to go. Ein Nifsek should not cease. On its own, it would have come to an end. And the Ein Sof is causing it to go on. Canal. Not because this itself is infinite, but because the Rotzna Beta is it's saying like this: if I threw a stone, it could only fly, let's say, 100 feet, 200 feet, 300 feet. When God throws a stone, he could throw and the stone will fly forever. It's the same stone. Did it change the stone? Did the stone become eternal? No. There's a force outside of it that's causing it to fly forever. It's the power of Ein Sof that can also give a stone, a regular stone, the power to fly forever. When I throw it, or a human being throws it, we only have limited power. And since the stone doesn't have any wings, it's not a bird, it doesn't fly on its own. So it'll only fly that much time. So on its own, it would only go that far. But with that Ein Sof power, it causes a gvul to go forever. So v'ima yes, and he's still qualifying. V'ima yes, and even though shegam zehu yichud, even though this is also a yichud, because the Ein Sof is uniting with the gvul. It's taking the gvul and causing it to be bli gvul. Nevertheless, hine amiti sa yichud hu shazman be'etzem hu bli gvul. The true union is deeper than that. is that the stone itself, in this case, actually becomes bli gvul. Zman itself becomes bli gvul. Not just that there's a bli gvul that's imposing itself on it and giving it that power, but it itself becomes bli gvul. Shazman be'etzem. It fundamentally is bli gvul. Why? Because it's a creation of God, and God creates gvul, and bli gvul is equal. And in that lies the bli gvul of the Eibishter. Like we find about space, just like we talk about time and space. Sha'amar Azal, the sages tell us in the Gemara, that the space of the ark does not have measure. What does that mean exactly? The ark was not bli gvul. The Odin had measure, had spatial measure, spatial parameters, parameters. Amasayim v'chetzi erke, 2.5 amos was its length. Next page, 1346. And at the same time, it says, Eina min amida. At the same time, you say it had no space, which means, as we know, that if you measured the Aron itself in the Holy of Holies, it had real parameters. There were real measurement. The Pasuk says what measurements it should have. And yet, when you placed it in the Holy of Holies and you measured from one wall to the next, it's as if it didn't exist, as if it didn't occupy space. Because usually, if you put an object and you measure from wall to wall, then the object in the middle takes up space. And here, it's as if you measured as if nothing was there. Harizeh, shamokim ubli mokim. So this is a level, not that a higher state of Ein Sof came in and took a limited space and said, no, don't be limited. Like I said with the stone before. But here, the mokim itself was bli mokim. There was one place on earth where God wanted to show what we call nimna nimnois, that space itself was like no space. And that's only possible from power of Atzmus, because something that's defined is defined. If it's not defined, it's not defined. To say that something that's defined at the same time has no parameters, that's this level. So the Rebbe Rashab is saying, so just like we find in space this idea, not that an outside force, but it's from within. That Zman itself has no finite parameters of time. And an example for this, like we find that the God showed Adam Harishan, Adam, der v'der shav. He showed him all the generations that would come. Harira kol der v'der mamish. So even though in time, a generation takes time for a generation to emerge. One generation, next generation. Adam Harishon did not live in our time. And yet Hashem showed him in one moment of time, Harira kol der v'der mamish. He saw literally every generation as if it was happening, without the limitation of time. In other words, even though time by definition is parameters, like with space, but here God was able to show him in one snapshot all of time. So this isn't just making time eternal through a power of Ein Sof. The time itself is as if it has no time, because the time itself has all the generations within it. I know this needs explanation. I just want to read inside, and then we can analyze this. Ukamaya Harizal, like the Harizal, shehisig b'shah achas, that he was able to comprehend in 1 hour, say the Satera, secrets of the Teda, that Masha'ilu hayibola imram, if you had to express it in words, hayitzarich zman shmeinim shana ritzufim, you would need 80 straight years to express what the Arizal was able to comprehend in 1 hour. Like he says in Priyetz Chaim, which is Sefer of the Arizal, the Reb Chaim Vital, in gate 19. So you see here in 1 hour, he had 80 years that would need to explain it or discuss it or express it in 1 hour. Ukamaya Baal Shem Tov, and like the Baal Shem Tov, another example, Shero Masha Osel Bisman, he was able to see the future, that which would come later. Shero Masha Osel Bisman Kaidim, in the earliest, he was able to see in his time, in the earlier time, that which would come in the future. He saw it as if it already happened. Keneda, as it is known. So all these are examples of Zman itself being L'mayla Zman. Not just Zman going eternally and not just being limited, which is a force outside, but time itself becoming beyond time. Now, I do know, I just want to see here. The truth is, I have a temptation to explain it right now, but I also see the Rebbe Rashab is going to explain it. So I think the better way to go is to hear what the Rebbe Rashab has to say first, and then to elaborate if need be. But the question is, should I read it on now, or should I? Let me see something here.
It's too good not to continue, Rabbi. We gotta go. We gotta push.
Yeah, no, I just want to see how much, because the next section is not 5 lines. It's a. Okay, let's continue reading, and then we always have time to explain. Good. By Inyan Hu, the Hinamashn is boiling ill, because now that which was explained earlier, Shazmanu Nitzchi, She'ena Nifsik, that time is eternal and does not cease. There, it's not that time actually goes on forever. Even though time will continue on forever, tomid, always, and will not stop. So even though it has the capacity to continue on, but nevertheless, you have to say that this Hamshacha, even though it's coming from Ein Sof and Zman, is in a manner that you can say that we have that many tens of thousands of years from Bria Salem, Ribui, Revovis. Ribui is 10,000. Even though, because he means here probably going into the future, because at this point, the world was only Tov Shin, Tov Reish, Ayin Vov years. But Ribui Revov is Shonim. Well, at least a multitude of many years from the time the world was created, and from when time began, Ada Ato. So you're capable of saying a certain amount of years and time from the beginning till now. Imken yesh legvul. So even when you talk about Zman that can go on forever, it has a gvul. You cannot, however, say that from the creation of the world, or from the beginning of time, and we need to understand what's the difference between creation of the world and beginning of time. It would seem to imply that beginning of time comes before the creation of the world, but regardless, that's what he says. Because you cannot say that from the creation of the world or from the beginning of time, Ada Ato who offers Zman Bli Gvul. You can't say that infinite amount of years passed from the beginning of time till now. Because anything that's fundamentally defined by parameters, by limits, who bal gvul will always remain. Even when you add to it days and years, it'll still always remain Baal Gvul. So what does it mean, Nitzchi? So why do you call it Adeyad, Nitzchi? The word Nitzchi here does not mean that you take Gvul and you made it Bli Gvul. It means it will never end. It will go on forever. The Yumshach Kain Tomid v'lo yichla le'elam, and will continue on forever and never end. But it doesn't mean that there doesn't have a beginning. The beginning till now has a defined time. So let's say, for example, God wants time to go on forever. But right now, wherever you are, time does have a limit. It just will go on forever, but you have not changed the Gvul into Bli Gvul. Time has not become an infinite entity. Like I said before with the stone, just because God's power to throw a stone can go forever doesn't make the stone infinite. It means the infinite power has given it an extension that doesn't have an ending. There's no expiration, so to speak. The Imkain, and therefore the Koyach HaNitzchi, this power of eternity, it's not that it actualized into actual infinite time. But rather is giving it the power to continue forever without end, without an end, without a stopping, without ending. But forever this man will be in a state of Gvul, with a Gvul, with given the power to go on forever. However, what we're talking about here, the true unification between Gvul and Bli Gvul is when the Zman itself will be actually infinite. That time itself will become beyond time, just like place is beyond place. In the parentheses, yes, v'zeh inyan yem shekulei orach, and that's the meaning when we say a day that will kulei orach, a day that will be forever long. What does that mean? You're not just saying a day that will extend forever, that the day will no longer be defined by the limits of time, the time of a day at all. Be one day that's qualitatively kulei orach, one that extends forever. Bli agbolas hazman. So you could type yem shekulei orach, a day that just goes on, but he's saying, no, the day itself will be transformed, that it should have no limits. He tells us to go in the name of the Rashbi. I'm not sure where that is. I have to look that up. On the pasuk, Yimeshna Seinu Behem, Shivim Shana. The years within him. Probably discusses this. And now he concludes the beginning what he said. And this is also the meaning what we said earlier at the beginning of the paragraph on page 1345, that Havaya will be it for you, Elam, an eternal light. The Elam Ulosha Nitzchius. The word Elam here means from eternal. Who Nitzchius Azman? This is the eternity of time, but not the first level that time goes on. That time itself will become eternal and Bli Gvul without limit, as we discussed earlier. Okay, now the question is, but it's still coming from Havaya. That's what he's going to address next. But I'm going to stop here because we have to stop somewhere, because we're not yet eternal, so we do have time limits. So the next section is going to be, what does it mean? Isn't Havaya causing Elikim to be this way? So he's going to explain two different ways, I see. So obviously this needs good explanation. What does Gvul mean that Gvul is Bli Gvul? So I'll just say one thing just for this class, and we'll talk about this more. This goes back to what we spoke about all the way many times. When we do something that's finite, it's limited. Like I said, we can throw a stone 100 feet or a few hundred feet. Everything we do has limited element. When God creates something then there's Bligvul. The Bligvul would be something that's unlimited. So these are two worlds, the finite and the infinite. So we learn now the infinite can impact the finite. God has the power to infuse the finite with something that's infinite. So the stone, which on its own could only fly that far, now goes forever. But there's another thing. When we create something, it's always, by definition, it has parameters. The question is, when God creates a finite entity, is it actually finite or not finite? Because on one hand, it's finite because God wants it to be finite. But remember, it's coming from the same infinite energy that creates infinity. So you could also argue that the finite is just another way of God expressing his infinity. That's very different than infinity impacting the finite to be forever. Here, the finite itself is another expression of God's infinite power, or even higher than infinite power. Because like we learned, the Helam Ha'atzmi is even deeper. It's coming from God choosing. He wants to have something that is limited. So the Koyach HaGvul that we learned from the Rishimu, that itself is God's infinite power. Like we spoke about the artist, of his infinite possibilities, he chooses one. From his point of view, it's just one choice, but it's really has in it the whole potency of the divine. And that means that the finite itself is just another expression of infinity. Not just that the finite is infused with infinity. So you have really three things: the finite, the infinite impacting the finite, and the finite creation of the finite itself being a force of the divine. And therefore, it's what we call Hagbala Atzmis, that God chose it to be finite. When we do something that's finite, is because we have to do it that way. You have no choice, but you have to go to sleep. You have no choice, but you have to eat at least once in 3 days. We all have kinds of limitations, not because we chose, but because it's fundamental that way to our being. It's inherent. Where God chooses to define himself, let's say, like we said, he chooses to take his presence and place it within the Aron, in the Kodesh Kodashim. That's a finite entity, but it's a finite that is just packaging God's infinity, that he chooses to place himself in that structure. We will not just reveal the infinite within the finite, we'll reveal how the finite itself will express the infinite divine, which ultimately goes even higher than Oyer and Helam Ha'atzmi, which we'll learn about and we have learned about. So that's just a little explanation on what we just learned. And that's expressed in the Mokim in space in the Aron, and in time, like he gave the examples for time being a time that's above time, time beyond time, not just a time that is infused with something that is eternal. Okay, so I'm going to stop here, middle of page 1346. If anybody wants to ask anything, please.
This also explains why mitzvot are eternal, because it has that power of godliness, infinite power in it, and it's therefore forever.
Yeah. On both levels, eternal in the first level, and also that even though it's a defined mitzvah, it really is that package you have essentially bli gvul.
Rabbi, the explanation of how Nitzchias applies to time and as it relates to La Silava, when we have a Gula Shlema, third temple, etc., the future, is it saying on the sending of Nitzchias relative to time, that time itself will have this quality of Nitzchias? Or is he just giving it as a mashal to understand what it means for eternalness?
I believe I just explained it. The first level is that God can throw a stone and it should fly forever. He can take a limited time and has fundamentally limited, and it should extend without end. That's the first level. The second level is time itself is an expression of God's power of infinity.
No, I get it. But what I'm asking is, as a practical matter, in terms of what we learn, Are we saying that in Zman Mashiach, time itself will have this eternal quality? There will be only one day, one permanent day forever. That's the question. Because
I don't know. I don't see that indicated here.
Okay. So what does it mean for atzmiistic kind of eternalness to come into reality and turn reality into eternalness? In terms of with
the
respect
higher
to
level or
time.
the lower level? In the higher level or the lower level?
I'm not sure I understand the two levels, to be honest.
There's two levels. One is that the infinite will cause the finite time to go forever. That's the yichud of Havaya and Elikim. And the second is that the Elikim itself, time itself, will be beyond time. That's the whole discussion.
I guess it's
Which one are you referring to?
The latter.
So what are you asking? The latter will be, will reveal that the finite existence and the finite time and space, it itself, as I just explained, is God's.
In other words, that's my question. That time will be beyond time. That there will be no such thing as a day anymore. There'll be one day that's one permanent day forever.
Why can't it be a regular 6-7 days in the week, and the years and months? You'll have all that, but that itself will reveal the divine power within it. Today we only see the finite element. Then we'll see the divine atzmizdika power within it. It doesn't have to change the way time is counted.
Okay. So you answered my question, and
I don't see any indication here that you need to change the way we measure time. It's the way we understand what that measure is. Just like the Aron will always be in its length 2.5 amas. That will not change, but that itself is beyond time, beyond space.
Okay, so you certainly answered my question. I just need to think about it more. But thank you.
We'll talk about it more. It's not finished the topic. I want to think about it as well more and understand the whole picture here. Because definitely not explained, but he's going to explain a little more afterwards. We'll see tomorrow where he's going with this. Okay, so I'm going to stop here in the middle of page.